Welcome to Watchman on the Wall, a daily outreach of Southwest Radio Ministries and SWRC.com. God is still on the throne, and prayer changes things. Another exciting week of bringing clarity to the chaos is here. Today, Micah Van Huss will begin a conversation with author Derek Gilbert, where they will discover the spiritual battles that shape our world. Later this week, Dr. Joe Cristiano will help us navigate better health with the stem cell revolution and the science behind blood types, body types, and you. Thank yous go out to everyone who attended our Prophecy in the News Live conference this past weekend in Bellevue, Washington. A great time of fellowship was had with our friends, new and old. Be sure to check out the events section of our website for a listing of future conferences and events. Up next is our one-day spiritual warfare conference, Defying the Demonic, set for Saturday, April 26th in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Registration is open right now. Visit swrc.com and click on Events. Today and tomorrow, Micah Van Huss and author Derek Gilbert is here, ready to reveal the spiritual battles that shape our world. It's time to delve into the gates of hell and uncover the secrets that Jesus confronted.
Welcome to the Marginal Mysteries program. Today we have with us Derek Gilbert, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, The Gates of Hell. Matthew 16:18 reads, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So Derek, it's wonderful to have you. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing better than I deserve, brother. It's good to be back on your program. And we're looking forward to seeing you again in June.
Yes, sir. Mysteries of the Bible Verse is coming up. We'll have a commercial for that. I look forward to seeing you and Sharon as well, and hearing you guys speak. In light of this verse, what is the significance of what Jesus is saying and the significance of where he is saying it? On this rock, I will build my church.
Yeah, this was at a place called Caesarea Philippi, which is today called Banyas. In the days of Jesus, it was called Paneas because it was sacred to the goat demon Pan, Paneas, Banyas. Caesarea Philippi was a cult center. It was dedicated to the cult of, well, a number of gods. It was a pagan pilgrimage site. You would go there, you would offer sacrifices in the temple to Jupiter, the temple to the cult of the emperor, the Roman emperor, to Pan, of course, to Nemesis. There was a healing center there for Asclepius, the demigod son of Apollo. Basically, it was a big pagan site at the foot of Mount Hermon. And the easiest and simplest way to describe Hermon is to call it the Canaanite Olympus. That's not original to me. A renowned scholar of ancient Near Eastern texts, Edward Lipinski, referred to it as such. And that's a good way of imagining it, or conceiving it. This is where the Canaanites, the Amorites, the pagans of the ancient world believed that their gods met to determine the fates of the world. So Jesus took his disciples and followers there from his base of operations in Capernaum, which is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's a 30-mile hike. Today, 30 miles, we'll drive 30 miles to go to the outlet mall, But back in the day, when you got to walk that across rough terrain in sandals, you really had to be intentional. You really had to want to go there for a specific purpose. Jesus brought his disciples to this pagan cult center to do two things. Number one, to ask people, who do people say the Son of Man is? And there's we could do just 25 minutes on that alone, that phrase and where it comes from. But suffice it to say that people understood in the first century that title, the Son of Man, referred to God's agent of judgment, who was coming back to the earth to punish rebellious angels, wicked kings, evil landowners, and so on. And secondly, was to ask his followers, who do you say that I am? And Peter, of course, had the correct answer. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus confirmed this by saying, yes, and this has not been confirmed to you, Peter, by flesh and blood, by humans, but by my Father in heaven. So you were granted this revelation directly from the throne. And I tell you, and it gets into some wordplay, you are Petros, you are Peter, and on this rock, this Petra, this 9,200-foot Canaanite Olympus we're standing in front of, I will build my congregation, my church, my ecclesia, and the gates of hell, which is this really big cave dedicated to Pan over here, will not prevail against it. Now, in the first century, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, no one had ever lowered a plumb line long enough to hit bottom. So they believed it was literally a bottomless cave that extended all the way down to the netherworld. Jesus literally went to what everyone in the ancient world knew were the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, and declared his divinity right there. Now, he could have said, look, portals are not real. It's all imaginary. It's fake news. But he didn't. He went there, a 14-hour hike in sandals with his followers to do it right there. And then, according to Matthew 17, 6 days later, he and James and John and Peter climbed Mount Hermon because that's the only very high mountain in the vicinity. And he was transformed into a being of light, which was essentially declaring his divinity to the spirit realm on the very top of the mountain where the Canaanites, the Amorites, the pagans believed their gods met. So this was a very specific thing that Jesus did. And the point of our book, The Gates of Hell, is that Jesus declared from the very beginning of his ministry, I mean, even prior to this, where he was baptized was in the middle of what would be supernaturally considered enemy territory. And he did it to declare war on these fallen spirit beings.
And I agree with you. I agree that Jesus was at Mount Hermon at this moment. And of course, he's talking about the Genesis 6 watchers who rebelled. And of course, this is also one of the primary topics of Michael Heiser's Reversing Hermon book. And of course, you partially dedicate this book to the late Michael Heiser. And you and I have both been there at the gates of hell. They've filled it in. If in fact you could drop a plumb line indefinitely, they've filled it in since. A profound place to be able to stand on this planet. Your book, you talk a bit about portals. So are these gates more than a metaphor? Are they an actual dimensional boundary or a portal?
Well, that's a really good question. We argue that it's yes, but in a couple of different ways. And we go back into prehistory and write about sites like Gilgal Rephaim, which is 10 miles east of the Sea of Galilee on the Golan Heights, which we've been to a few times now. Other sites such as Göbekli Tepe, which archaeologists have referred to, maybe not accurately, but it's a catchy title, the world's oldest temple, which was abandoned about 5,000 years before Gilgal Rephaim was even built. But in the ancient world, even threshing floors, which were typically built on, were placed on the tops of hills so that the winds could help blow away the chaff when the wheat was being sifted. Those were considered points of contact between this world and the next. Mountains, my first book, The Great Inception, was all about how mountains were considered the domain or domicile of gods in the ancient world and how many supernatural things are connected to mountains in the Bible. But beyond that, we argue that the human heart is essentially another gateway, and that humans from the very beginning, from prehistory to the present day, are trying to open those gates through various means, through rituals, through pharmakia, taking drugs to open one's perceptions into the spirit realm, even through the modern UFO phenomenon and the belief that we are somehow that we're in contact with extraterrestrials, and how that is actually just another manifestation of this ancient belief that we are in contact with supernatural entities who will help us ascend either to another level of evolution or to be resurrected, to return somehow, to overcome the curse of death.
And that's an ancient story or an ancient promise. That's, of course, what the Nakash, the serpent in the garden, tells Eve. It says, if you eat this fruit, you will be like God. That's not a modern tale. And that's what these secret societies and the princes of the powers of the air are trying to tell us through the New Age movement, their Hermetic religions, that we don't need God. We can become God ourselves. We can overcome death. We can ascend into the stars. Do you think that there are modern locations where the influence of the gates of hell are still active?
Probably yes. And I say probably because this is not something we can confirm, but there are certain locations where supernatural things tend to happen more frequently, or at least they're more frequently reported. Certainly there are things where strange, inexplicable events have taken place. I'm thinking of the work that L.A. Marzulli has done at Fatima, for example, about 100 years ago, where you had hundreds of witnesses to what appeared to be a supernatural event in Portugal, a site called Fatima. Is the Grotto of Pan at the base of Mount Hermon, is Mount Hermon itself a portal? I don't know, but certainly there are people who tend to think that there are sites where these points of contact, where contact is more easily made. Let's put it this way. And going back to the ancient world, mountains were certainly considered those. I mean, the whole point of the Tower of Babel was not to literally build a structure that would reach the sky. I would argue that even 5,000 years ago, structural engineers knew you couldn't stack mud brick high enough to literally reach heaven. But it's because they were trying to emulate mountains, which everybody in the ancient world knew that's where the gods congregated. So if we can build an artificial mountain, a ziggurat, a step pyramid, a pyramid in Egypt, that's the point of those structures, building a point of contact between this world and the next. But again, I suggest, and we've argued this in a number of books, that when you open yourself up to the spirit realm, you, in effect, become a gate of hell.
And you've gotten to the Tower of Babel. You have mentioned the congregation of the gods, and those of us who believe that the ziggurats, the pyramids, are an attempt to reach the high places to get to the gods. You actually say something in your book, talks about the possibility of these gates underneath the Tower of Babel or underneath the pyramids. I found that fascinating. If you'll tell us a little bit about it.
Well, yeah, the archaeologists who dug at a site in southeast Iraq called, in the ancient world, Eridu, found a temple there dedicated to the god Enki. Now, Enki was the clever god. He was the god of magic and wisdom. He alone among the Mesopotamian gods was the only one who was friendly to humans all the time. According to the Mesopotamian flood myths, he's the one who warned their Noah character that a flood was imminent and to build a boat. But his temple was called the Abzu, which means house of the abyss. The Abzu is the Sumerian word from which we get the Greek word abusos, where we get, the English word abyss. So he lived in the bottomless pit. There was supposedly an underground freshwater ocean, which was his domain. And from there, he sent forth these characters called the Abgal or the Apkalu, who were essentially the equivalent of the characters Jewish religious scholars knew as the sons of God from Genesis chapter 6, referred to in the extra-biblical book of First Enoch as the Watchers, the rebellious Watchers. There are faithful Watchers as well. Anyway, Enki was an ancient deity worshipped from the very beginning in Mesopotamia. Eridu was supposedly the very first Sumerian city. And when the archaeologists there in 1949 excavated, they found 18 levels to this temple. But the uppermost level, which would have been the largest, and certainly the oldest, but it would have been the largest ziggurat step pyramid in all of Mesopotamia, larger than the great ziggurat of Ur, larger than the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, but it was never finished. When they dug this up in 1949, they found that for some reason, it was never finished, and very soon after it was abandoned, it was covered over by drifting sand. Now, why would that be? Well, we know the answer from the book of Genesis. They left off building the city. So the question is, why would God be compelled to come down to this site built directly above the abyss? And according to a surviving Sumerian poem, this was to be an abode of the gods. The king of Uruk, which not coincidentally was the home city of Nimrod, according to the Bible, was going to build this as a gleaming abode of the gods, a gleaming mountain, the abode of the gods. Now, would it have worked? I don't think so, unless God himself allowed it. But what he was telling the people was, look, you don't want to be in contact or communion with me. All right, I will send to you, after I divide your languages and divide you up, I will send other angels or angelic beings down to oversee you. And this is what we read in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. When God gave the nations their inheritance, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. It's similar to when God told Samuel, the prophet Samuel, to anoint Saul king over all Israel. Okay, I'll give them what they want, but they're not going to be happy about it. And that's exactly what happened at Babel.
Give us a little bit more information on these 17 stories, because if you think about something that's 3,000 to 5,000 years old, 17 stories up or down is very advanced technology for people who are that old.
Yeah, no, it's actually 17 different temples going back to about 5,000 BC. So we're talking about 7,000 years old. But as one needed to be expanded, and the oldest one is very small, just a 10 by 10 room. But by the time they, this one's crumbling because it's made of mud brick. They didn't have stone in southeast Iraq, mainly just mud and sand. They had to expand when they expanded it, when it began to crumble. So 18 different temple layers And again, the top layer coincided, interestingly, with the end of the period of history scholars call the Uruk period, which was when that city, the home of Nimrod, dominated all of the Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Turkey, under the control of that city in southeast Iraq called Uruk. But the collapse or the abandonment of that temple above the abyss coincided with the end of that period of history. Again, it's archaeologists inadvertently confirming the narrative of the Bible, because it was at that point all the languages were confused and Uruk could no longer dominate all of Mesopotamia, all of the Fertile Crescent.
It's a bad day for them when they accidentally confirm the Bible. That's the last thing they want to do. So let's get
Exactly.
let's get a little bit into the secret societies, the global elites, and how they factor into the concept of opening the gates of hell. Now, you got into the Swiss Alps, the tunnels in the Swiss Alps, and you mentioned a video of one of the opening ceremonies. I saw this exact video, a creepy, weird video. I have no idea why they've got such demonic imagery in opening a tunnel in the Swiss Alps. Get into CERN a little bit. So tell us how you think these secret societies or the global elites factor into, maybe in the future or currently, opening the gates of hell.
Yeah, Sharon did a really wonderful job in analyzing the video, and it's even more effective when she shows you the screen captures. But given that this was copyrighted imagery, we didn't want to put it in the book and risk a lawsuit here. But she described it, I think, very well. When the tunnel through the Alps, it was the Goddard Base Tunnel, which began to be planned back in 1947. It was a way to run rail line through the Alps, because getting through those mountains obviously very difficult. But when it was opened back in 2016, the people, leaders from all across the European Union showed up there, and they had just a very bizarre ceremony that involved a man in a goat man costume looking almost like Krampus, which is somehow connected with Christmas in the European tradition, but a goat demon similar to Pan, I suppose. Some very overtly sexual dancing and posing, and what appears to be a child that results from this. Just some very bizarre imagery. Why this would be connected, and again, Sharon goes into in some depth, but there's a strange historic connection to that region of the Swiss Alps, and an old story about how they built a bridge across it originally and involved the devil in the construction, Satan in the construction of this pass. So it's a very ancient tradition there. One end of the tunnel is less than 200 miles from Geneva, Switzerland, which is where CERN and the Large Hadron Collider are located. And I know there's been a lot written about the Large Hadron Collider, and are they trying to open the gates to other dimensions? Maybe they are, but I would just remind viewers that those gates to the abyss don't open until God allows the angel with the key to come down. And we're not quite there yet. We've got a lot to go through before we get to Revelation chapter 9.
Your very small chapter of Before the Flood, one of the things I did want to talk about is the head shaping. So if you'll explain to the folks watching, what is head shaping and why do cultures do it?
Well, we can only speculate because this is prehistoric, but presumably they're trying to emulate something or please something with which they were familiar. Head shaping is the practice of binding the heads of infants. This is known in the historic period. The tribe of Indians, and it starts with a C, and again, I'm forgetting the name, not Cascadia, but in the Pacific Northwest. We know that this was done fairly recently. People may be familiar with the Peruvian skulls, but when I started looking into the practice of head shaping to create conical, cone-shaped heads in the ancient world, it turns out that this appears to be a universal practice based on remains found in the ancient Near East. We're talking the lands of the Bible, from Turkey to Jericho, some ancient examples found there, but it appears to have been pretty much universal. I mean, it cut across all social classes as far as we can tell. Again, this is long before the invention of writing, or the oldest discovered writing anyway, so we don't know exactly why they did it, but from using the numbers that archaeologists use, from roughly 10,000 BC down to about 5,000, 4,000 BC, in that range, it appears to be universal in what is now Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. All of those lands, it appears that these cone-shaped heads, that everybody had these cone-shaped heads, which was not a natural or genetic thing. This was done artificially, and apparently to appease something or to look like something. And in fact, at Eridu, the site of that ancient temple above the abyss to the god Enki, the lord of the abyss, they found 205 sets of remains there. And every one of them, every one of the 205 sets of remains had deformed skulls. Now, the archaeologist who worked at the site back in 1949 argued that it was due to earth pressure. In other words, after they were buried, the pressure of the ground on top of them misshaped, caused their skulls to deform. But without cracking them, he showed a remarkable lack of interest or curiosity in why that was. The papers that I found on it, the scholars admit there's not a whole lot of research on this because I assume serious scholars don't want to be labeled as fringe. And so they tend not to dig too deeply into this subject. Yeah, this has been found all over the world. Again, you've got the cultures in Peru that were doing this in the within the last 2,000 years, but this goes back to before the invention of the wheel, before the invention of pottery. This was, and apparently, according to the scholars who've done some work on this, the lands of the Bible, the ancient Near East, was ground zero for this phenomenon.
And I was getting ready to go into that, and I'll go into it for just a second. Did the serpentine, Nakash angels or fallen angels that they worship, did they have the elongated skulls? If you look at Akhenaten, Pharaoh Akhenaten, he has a long skull on all of the hieroglyphs painted of him. Even King Tut, the scans that we have of King Tut, he doesn't have the extremely long skull, but it's definitely longer than ours. So were they emulating their gods is, I think, the mainstream theory on it, but a fascinating topic.
A number of figurines that have been found around ancient Eridu, between Eridu and Uruk, which are very close to each other in what is now southeastern Iraq. These little figurines that look like, they're called ophidian by scholars, which means snake-like, but they've actually got cone-shaped heads, coffee bean-type eyes. They look reptilian, except that there are a number of them that have been found that are definitely female, and they appear to be suckling a young. Now, that's a mammalian trait, not a reptilian trait. Again, is this what the Nakash looked like? We have no way to know. We can only speculate because writing hadn't been invented, or if it had been, it wasn't preserved on anything that we found yet.
Another fascinating thing in your book that I want to talk about a little bit, in your chapter, The Great Below, you say that occult practices from 5,000 years ago are still being conducted today, specifically in southern Turkey, and that the spirits are summoned from across bodies of water, and the whole bodies of water summoning spirits fascinated me. So if you'll talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I really stumbled onto this. Actually, it was directed to it by Sharon, who's the smart one in our family. A group of people known in the Bible as the Horites, called the Hurrians in the ancient world. Ancient people who appear to have originated on the plain of Ararat, meaning the lowlands below the mountains where Noah's Ark came to rest, brought with them a practice of digging ritual pits and then sacrificing to the underworld gods in those ritual pits to summon them ask them for favors, to get information from them or what have you. We know that they came from the Ararat plain. And this is because they had a very unique style of pottery that archaeologists have been able to trace across the millennia. They made it to the Sea of Galilee region by about 2850 BC. And we know the Horites show up in the Bible in a number of locations as far south as Mount Sinai. The kings of the east, when they came to do battle with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, encountered the Horites at the wilderness of Paran, which is near Mount Sinai. This practice, which archaeologists have traced through this people group, shows up in the Bible in terms of summoning from below. King Saul went to the owner of a ritual pit. The medium of Endor, the witch of Endor, she was the owner of a ritual pit. Remember, the spirit of Samuel sent back to give Saul a message by God was from the great below. But part of this ritual pit involved a sacred waterway that the Hurrians appear to have incorporated into some of these sites that have been excavated by archaeologists. And again, the idea is that on the other side of this sacred waterway, kind of like the river Styx in Greek mythology, were these spirits who had to be summoned from the other side. Again, there's some really interesting stuff. And I don't want to, I know our time is limited, so I'm trying to put it as on the fly here inside my head. But there's some really interesting references in history. One that was connected to a character who may have been one of the guys responsible for the Trojan War, so who swore a treaty based on this divine waterway, one of the Hittite princes. Fascinating stuff.
There's something about the water, and we started to talk about it a little bit a year ago on the radio. There's something about the water, and I haven't figured it out, We're going to keep taking notes and we may never figure it out. But the river Styx, we're talking about demons in the dry places in the Bible. We're talking about baptism. We're talking about all kinds of things where there's something about demons in water, the pigs running into the water. We're going to figure it out one day, I hope.
Well, the representation in the Bible, the Old Testament, it's clear that the sea, which in Hebrew the word is yam, represents chaos. And not coincidentally, that word yam is the name of the Canaanite chaos dragon, the equivalent of Leviathan. Yam is the chaos monster defeated by their chief god, Baal. Isaiah, of course, quotes from the Baal cycle in the description of Leviathan, that fleeing serpent, that twisting serpent, that comes right out of the Canaanite Baal cycle. But it's saying that, no, you Canaanites, you pagans have it wrong. It wasn't Baal who subdued chaos. It was Yahweh. But yeah, that connection to the abyss, the bottomless pit, and the sea is evident in the Bible. Clearly, there's something about this connection of to deities on the other side of the abyss or at the bottom of the sea in pagan literature as well. It's just we're getting the true story, or at least glimpses into the true story in the Bible.
Azazel's in the desert. The children of Israel sacrificed the scapegoat to Azazel in the desert. Anyway, folks, you've been talking with Derek Gilbert. We've been listening to him about his new book, The Gates of Hell. He will be speaking for Southwest Radio Ministries at the Ministries of the Bible Verse Conference, June 13th and 14th this year. Be sure to come on out so you can get your tickets at marginalmysteries.com, marginalmysteries.com.
The Gates of Hell by Derek and Sharon Gilbert exposes an ancient enemy Jesus confronted at the start of his ministry, whose influence has shaped history and whose identity is hidden in plain sight. From his baptism site known as the entrance to the underworld, to the Transfiguration and Olivet Discourse locations, Jesus revealed the threat of this powerful entity, a figure possibly more dangerous than Satan. With research-driven insights, the Gilberts explore this dark force's connection to Israel's conflicts, symbols in the U.S. Capitol, and the four horsemen colors of the Palestinian flag. The Gates of Hell uncovers a prophecy about America's future and the return of Apollyon, the destroyer. Order your copy of The Gates of Hell today. Simply call 1-800-652-1144. You can also order The Gates of Hell on our website, swrc.com. Tomorrow, Derek Gilbert will continue his study on the spiritual battles that shape our world. Be sure to tune in by downloading our free SWRC mobile app or by subscribing to our daily Watchman on the Wall podcast. Watchman on the Wall is a production of Southwest Radio Ministries and is supported by faithful listeners like you. Please visit our website, swrc.com.